Ladies and gentlemen, today we are witnessing a turning point in modern history. What was presented as a show of strength has instead become a source of deep suffering. Vladimir Putin's war, launched with promises of power and security, is now backfiring in ways the Kremlin never expected. Across Russia, ordinary citizens are taking to the streets, not over foreign policy, but over something far more basic: unlivable conditions, economic collapse, and a future stolen by war. These mass protests are not just acts of defiance. They are a powerful signal that the cost of this conflict is being paid at home. Today, we will explore how Putin's war has ignited nationwide unrest and what this growing resistance means for Russia and the world. Russia's war has triggered a deep economic collapse that is now shaping the daily reality of millions of ordinary citizens. What began as a military operation abroad has evolved into a costly and prolonged conflict that continues to drain national resources at an alarming rate. Massive military spending has redirected funds away from essential public services, leaving healthcare, education, and infrastructure underfunded. As state priorities shift toward sustaining the war effort, the economic burden is increasingly placed on the population, particularly on low and middle-income households that were already struggling before the conflict began. International sanctions have further intensified this economic strain. Restrictions on trade, technology, banking, and energy markets have weakened the Russian economy and disrupted supply chains. Imported goods have become scarce or prohibitively expensive, forcing prices to rise across nearly every sector. Inflation has eroded purchasing power, turning once affordable necessities into financial burdens. Food prices, utilities, housing costs, and transportation expenses continue to climb, while wages fail to keep pace, leaving families unable to meet basic needs. The collapse of small and medium-sized businesses has added another layer to the crisis. Many enterprises have been forced to shut down due to lack of access to foreign components, declining consumer demand, and rising operating costs. This has led to job losses, reduced working hours, and growing unemployment, particularly in regional cities far from Moscow. For many Russians, economic insecurity is no longer a distant fear, but an everyday reality marked by uncertainty and desperation. As savings shrink and debts grow, households are making painful sacrifices, cutting back on food, healthcare, and heating during harsh winters. Pensions and social benefits, once seen as a safety net, are no longer sufficient to protect the elderly and vulnerable. The rising cost of living has exposed a widening gap between state propaganda and lived experience, fueling anger and frustration. This economic collapse is not merely a financial crisis, it is a social one, undermining trust in leadership and pushing citizens to question whether the war's costs are worth the suffering they now endure at home. Across Russia, protests have erupted as shortages, inflation, and the collapse of public services begin to dominate everyday life. What makes these demonstrations significant is not their scale alone, but their cause. People are no longer gathering primarily over political ideology or foreign policy, but over survival. Empty shelves, rising food prices, unreliable utilities, and deteriorating healthcare systems have pushed ordinary citizens to a breaking point. In cities and remote regions alike, frustration has spilled into the streets as daily hardships become impossible to ignore. Inflation has rapidly transformed basic necessities into luxuries. Staple foods, medicine, fuel, and household goods now consume a disproportionate share of household income. Families who once lived modest but stable lives are being forced to make difficult choices between heating their homes, feeding their children, or seeking medical care. In many regions, wages and pensions have remained stagnant while prices continue to rise, leaving people trapped in a cycle of declining living standards with no clear relief in sight. Shortages have compounded these struggles. Disrupted supply chains and reduced imports have led to inconsistent availability of essential goods. Pharmacies face medicine shortages, hospitals lack critical equipment, and public transportation systems suffer from poor maintenance and reduced services. Schools and clinics, especially in rural areas, are increasingly understaffed and under-resourced. For many citizens, these failures feel like abandonment by the state at a time when support is most needed. Public services that once symbolized stability are now visibly deteriorating. Power outages, heating failures, and water disruptions have become more frequent, particularly during winter months. Roads, housing, and municipal infrastructure show clear signs of neglect. As conditions worsen, patience has worn thin, and fear of repression is no longer enough to silence public anger. Protesters are demanding accountability, relief, and dignity, not slogans or promises. These nationwide protests reflect a shift in public consciousness. Economic pain and service failures have united diverse groups across generations and regions. What was once quiet discontent has evolved into open resistance, signaling that the social contract between the state and its citizens is under unprecedented strain. Public anger in Russia is shifting dramatically, moving from abstract concerns over foreign policy to immediate, tangible issues that affect daily survival. For years, state-controlled media framed the war abroad as a matter of national pride and strategic necessity, attempting to rally support around patriotic narratives. But for millions of citizens, these messages have lost their persuasive power in the face of widespread suffering at home. Families struggling with rising costs, empty store shelves, and failing public services are beginning to see the war not as a distant conflict, but as the root cause of their hardships. The disconnect between government messaging and lived experience has fueled frustration, leading ordinary people to question the very decisions that have led to this crisis. This shift in anger is particularly evident among groups that were previously politically quiet. Young professionals, pensioners, and rural communities, all affected differently by the economic strain, are uniting under a shared sense of injustice. Where once fear and apathy kept people compliant, desperation is now driving them to act. Citizens are organizing protests, speaking out online, and demanding answers about how resources are being allocated. The focus is not abstract ideology, but very real grievances: skyrocketing inflation, unreliable public services, food and medicine shortages, and the growing inability to maintain a basic standard of living. Social media has amplified this change in sentiment. Images and stories from affected families circulate rapidly, showing the human cost of decisions made far from everyday life. These first-hand accounts erode the credibility of official narratives and make the struggle personal, sparking empathy and solidarity across regions. As anger spreads, it no longer remains confined to urban centers, but reaches smaller towns and villages, highlighting the nationwide scale of frustration. This growing public anger carries broader implications for Russia's political landscape. When citizens prioritize survival over propaganda, the legitimacy of leadership is called into question. The focus on domestic hardships demonstrates that support for the war is conditional, dependent on citizens' ability to live decently. As more people speak out, the pressure on the Kremlin increases, and the gap between state priorities and public needs becomes impossible to ignore. This transformation in public sentiment, from passive acceptance to active demand for change, is a clear signal that domestic discontent could become as significant a challenge to the government as any external threat. The growing pressure on the Kremlin and the risks to internal stability have become increasingly apparent as mass protests continue to spread across Russia. What was initially a localized expression of frustration over unlivable conditions has evolved into a nationwide challenge for the government. Citizens from diverse regions, backgrounds, and age groups are voicing their anger not only through street demonstrations, but also online campaigns and community networks. This surge in civic action signals a weakening of the Kremlin's traditional control over public opinion, exposing vulnerabilities in governance that have long been masked by state propaganda and media censorship. The authorities are now confronted with a population that is no longer willing to accept hardship silently, and the pressure is mounting in ways that could have long-term political consequences. The combination of economic collapse, shortages, and declining public services has amplified public dissatisfaction. As families struggle to cope with rising living costs and dwindling access to basic necessities, the perception that the government prioritizes war over welfare has fueled anger. Protests are occurring not just in major urban centers, but also in smaller towns and rural areas, demonstrating the widespread nature of discontent. Each demonstration, while sometimes small, contributes to a larger wave of pressure that the Kremlin cannot easily ignore. The sheer scale and persistence of these protests indicate that this is not a passing moment of unrest, but a sustained challenge to state authority. Internal stability risks are also rising as the protests intersect with existing social, economic, and political tensions. Local officials and law enforcement are often caught between the need to maintain order and the growing sympathy for protesters' grievances. This creates fractures within the administrative structure, as enforcement measures risk alienating the very communities they are meant to pacify. Moreover, the visibility of dissent encourages others to speak out, creating a ripple effect that further destabilizes the perception of control. The Kremlin now faces a delicate balancing act. Heavy-handed suppression risks escalating tensions and drawing international scrutiny, while inadequate responses could embolden the public and encourage further mobilization. This growing pressure reflects a fundamental challenge: the disconnect between state priorities and the lived reality of citizens. If left unresolved, these protests over unlivable conditions could evolve into a broader movement capable of reshaping domestic politics, challenging not only the government's policies but also its legitimacy and long-term hold on power. In conclusion, the consequences of Putin's war are no longer confined to distant battlefields. They have arrived at the doorsteps of ordinary Russians. The economic collapse, rising prices, and collapsing public services have transformed daily life into a struggle for survival. As citizens face shortages and hardship, anger is shifting from abstract debates over foreign policy to the very real failures of governance at home. Nationwide protests are a clear signal that people are no longer willing to suffer silently. They are demanding accountability, relief, and a voice in a system that has long ignored their needs. This unrest carries profound implications for the Kremlin and the stability of Russia itself. The growing pressure from citizens across generations and regions exposes vulnerabilities in governance, highlighting the widening gap between state priorities and public needs. When the cost of war is measured not just in lives abroad but in suffering at home, public patience wears thin, and the legitimacy of leadership comes into question. What we are witnessing is more than isolated demonstrations. It is a powerful collective response to systemic neglect, one that could reshape the political landscape if ignored. Ultimately, the story of these protests is a reminder that no government can sustain power by prioritizing conflict over the welfare of its people. Citizens' resilience, courage, and willingness to stand up against unlivable conditions demonstrate that social and economic realities matter as much as military might. Putin's war may have been intended to project strength, but at home, it has revealed fragility. The voices in the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and beyond are telling the world, and the Kremlin itself, that a nation's true strength lies not in aggression abroad, but in the ability to provide safety, stability, and dignity to its own people. In the end, the future of Russia will depend not on the outcomes of battles fought overseas, but on the government's response to the demands, struggles, and resilience of its citizens. History is being written in these streets, and the consequences of ignoring this domestic crisis may prove far greater than any battlefield defeat. The message is clear. The war that was meant to secure power has instead ignited a movement that cannot be silenced, and the world is watching closely.